My name is David Warner Matheson, and for several years I've been exploring the stars and heavenly cycles as the foundation beneath the ancient myths and scriptures of virtually every culture on our planet. Overwhelming evidence argues that the world's ancient myths and scriptures are all connected by a common language or a common code, a code based on the stars and heavenly cycles. By this I mean that virtually all the characters and events in the sacred stories are based on specific constellations in the heavens, and that the location of those constellations within the great heavenly cycles, such as the annual cycle and the precessional cycle, has an established meaning within this ancient worldwide system. And that code is used by the world's myths and scriptures to convey profound truths for our benefit and our understanding. This shared system explains why we can see strong parallels between myths from around the world. These parallels are unmistakable and have already become the focus for entire schools of scholarly inquiry, although generally without an understanding that this shared celestial code ties them together and explains the parallels and similarities between the characters and the episodes found in the widely dispersed and very different cultures. There are clear parallels, for example, between the events described in the Gospel accounts of the New Testament scriptures and the events described in the Odyssey of ancient Greece, which was probably written down sometime in the 8th century before what we call the Christian era. The Odyssey includes a baptism episode at the beginning of Odysseus' journey, an imprisonment in a cave with a great stone at the entrance that must be rolled away, a descent to the underworld and a return from the underworld, and an important foot washing scene. Even more specifically, there's the prophecy of Tiresias involving a winnowing fan, which Odysseus must carry on his shoulder, and which has direct parallels to words spoken by John the Baptist regarding the arrival of one who will come after him, whose fan is on his shoulder. These parallels are remarkable, and they can be shown to stem from the fact that the ancient stories are using the same specific constellations, but dramatizing them with different characters and events which have been stretched over those constellations and heavenly cycles in the different cultures, in the different myths. Once we begin to understand the system, we can start to recognize the constellations underneath, which form the structure or the skeleton over which the metaphorical characters are stretched over them, so to speak. Today I'd like to examine another remarkable set of parallels, this time focusing specifically on the stories of the birth of the Buddha and the birth of the Christ. The stories of the birth of the Buddha can be shown to have been commented upon in written texts dating at least to the 3rd century before what we call the Christian era, although this does not at all mean that the stories of the birth of Christ are copies of the Buddha story any more than the gospel events are copies of the Odysseus story. They're all part of a very ancient system of tremendous antiquity, which can be shown to predate even the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, a system whose origin is now unknown and was probably unknown even in those ancient times. It's a system that underlies the various manifestations that may have come later, but can all be shown to be built upon this common, extremely ancient system. In the story of the birth of the Buddha, as I've discussed in previous writings and videos, we have strong parallels to the story of the birth of the Christ. In this video, we'll focus on 3 aspects of the story of Buddha's birth. First, the fact that his mother, Maya, apparently conceives or discovers that she's with child after a miraculous dream in which the Buddha enters her side in the form of an elephant. Second, the fact that the Buddha, when he's born, is likely associated with the constellation Ophiuchus, which is a tremendously important constellation and one with which Christ in the New Testament gospel accounts will also be associated in many important episodes. And then the third is the fact that after the birth of the Buddha, an old sage declares that he can now depart this life in peace. And that has parallels in the gospel account of the birth of the Christ as well. The Buddhist texts and traditions describe a dream in which Maya, the mother of the Buddha-to-be, has a dream during a midsummer festival and dreamt this dream. The four kings raised her together with the bed and took her to the Himalaya, to the Manosila tableland, 60 leagues in length, and placing her beneath a great sal tree 7 leagues high, they stood on one side. And then their queens took the queen Maya to the lake Anotata, bathed her to remove all impurities, robed her in a divine dress, anointed her with perfumes, and decked her with divine flowers. And not far from there is Silver Mountain, and on it a golden palace, and there they prepared and set a divine bed. And then Bodhisattva became a white elephant. Not far from there is a certain golden mountain, and the Bodhisattva went there and descended from it and ascended Silver Mountain, and approaching it from the north, in his trunk he was holding a white lotus, and then he trumpeted and entered the golden palace and made a right-wise circle 3 times around his mother's bed and smote her right side and seemed to enter her womb. Thus, at the end of the midsummer festival, he received new existence. That's when he incarnated in the womb of Queen Maya. Of course, the surrounding details of this story differ from the story of the birth of Christ, but both can be shown to be based on celestial figures, and both obviously have strong parallels. In this story, I would argue that when Queen Maya bathes in Lake Anotata in her dream, she's associated with the constellation Sagittarius at the edge of the widest portion of the Milky Way band in the heavens, which can be shown to have been envisioned as a pool or grotto in numerous myths from around the world. When Artemis is bathing, for example, attended by her nymphs in the story of Artemis and Actaeon, she's also associated with Sagittarius at the edge of this widening of the Milky Way. When Aphrodite retreats to Cyprus to be bathed by her graces after the embarrassing episode of her amorous affair with the god Ares, she can also be shown to be associated with Sagittarius at the edge of this widening pool in the Milky Way. Indeed, in the book of Samuel, when David is out on the roof and he spies the beautiful Bathsheba in the act of bathing, she is also undoubtedly associated with Sagittarius at the edge of the Milky Way's widest and brightest region. In the text of the Buddha account, we're told that there's a mountain nearby, and that's almost certainly the figure of Ophiuchus, which will often play the role of a mountain or other hill-like terrain feature in the world's myths. When Queen Maya's attendants in the dream prepare a bed for her, and she lies down in it before the elephant comes, she's most likely associated with Virgo the Virgin, just as I've shown in other videos that the Virgin Mary is also undoubtedly associated with the form of the constellation Virgo, the Virgin, this heavenly Virgin. The Bodhisattva takes the form of an elephant and approaches from the north. I would argue that this is probably describing the constellation Boötes, a constellation who is north of Virgo and whose outline has a rather large head and this pipe-like feature, which translates into the trunk of an elephant, could be envisioned as the trunk of the head of an elephant. In this sculptured relief, for instance, we can see the elephant descending towards the side of the recumbent Queen Maya, very much as Boötes is positioned above the constellation Virgo in the heavens. And in this more modern depiction, you can see the queen there, and you can see the elephant heading towards her. And on one side, we have an attendant who's holding an umbrella, and on the other side, an attendant who's holding like a whisk, or a whisk of peacock feathers. These are described in some of the ancient accounts, and they correspond to celestial details nearby to the constellations of Virgo and Boötes, namely Coma Berenices and then Ophiuchus again. All of these stories, all the features in these stories can be shown to have celestial foundations. When the Buddha to be is born, he's sometimes described as having a lotus flower in one hand, just as the elephant in the dream is sometimes described as holding a lotus flower at the end of its trunk. The constellation Virgo is often envisioned in various ancient myths as giving birth to the constellation Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is the child of Virgo in many different stories. For example, I've explained in other videos that in the Genesis account of the expulsion from the garden, when we read in Genesis 3 verse 15 that the seed of the woman will bruise the head of the seed of the serpent, and vice versa, the seed or offspring of the woman is clearly Ophiuchus, located directly above the constellation Scorpio and bruising the head of Scorpio, even as Scorpio bruises the heel of Ophiuchus. This verse is interpreted by many Christian thinkers as being a prophecy regarding the incarnation of Christ. In the stories regarding the Buddha, the birth of the Buddha, the child is sometimes said to be holding this lotus flower in one hand, and you can note that the outline of Ophiuchus has this distinctive feature, often interpreted as a serpent. That's where the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, gets its name. Holding this serpent, and on one side the serpent is the head side of the serpent, the other is the tail side of the serpent. But instead of being envisioned as the head of the serpent, this little triangular part of the constellation's outline can also be envisioned as a lotus flower held in one hand of the figure of Ophiuchus. So Ophiuchus is almost certainly, at least in some aspects of the Buddha story, plays the role of the Buddha himself. And there are many examples of episodes in the Gospels in which Christ is specifically associated with Ophiuchus as well, including, in fact, the crucifixion scene in which he's crucified in between two thieves. I go into that in more detail in my book, Star Myths of the Bible. When the Buddha to be is born, so now the third aspect of this story, there's this hermit, this great ascetic, this hermit Asita, who lives as an ascetic. He is always meditating on spiritual things, and he comes when the Buddha is born. Asita arrives, and everybody's fairly astonished, and he comes to the palace of the king's father. He comes to the palace of the king's father, King Suddhodana, and informs the king that this child will master his passions and understand truth and dispel error from the world with the light of his knowledge. The king asks Asita why he's weeping, and Asita says that it's only because he himself will not see, he won't live to see all these things, because his own life is now drawing towards its close. And this encounter has very strong parallels to the episode described in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, in which a holy man named Simeon is described, who's been waiting for the birth of the Messiah in very much the same way that Asita is described as longing for the coming of the Buddha. In the text of the Gospel of Luke, we read, beginning in verse 25, and behold, there was a man in Jerusalem. This is Luke 2, beginning in verse 25. And behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and the same man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Ghost was upon him, and it was revealed unto him by the Holy Ghost that he should not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came by the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him after the custom of the law, then took he him up in his arms, and blessed God, and said, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all the people, a light to lighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. And Simeon blessed them, and said unto Mary his mother, Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against. Yea, a sword shall pierce through thy own soul also, and the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. So Simeon takes up the child in his arms, just as Asita in the Buddhist text is described as taking up the baby, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be. I'm not convinced there's enough textual evidence to positively associate either Simeon or Asita with a specific constellation, unless it's Ophiuchus again, but I believe it's quite obvious that the language being used here is celestial in nature and refers specifically to celestial cycles. For example, Simeon says, this child, or this, he doesn't actually, there's no actual noun associated with this. He just says this in the actual scriptural text. This is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against. The description of the fall and rising again can be seen to describe the motions of stars and constellations and planets and our sun and our moon in the sky. They set in the west, they rise again in the east. And then the word sign, of course, has heavenly constellations in reference to the signs of the zodiac wheel. The part at the end in which Simeon says to Mary that a sword shall pierce through her own soul also probably has a celestial reference as well to the outline of the constellation Virgo, which has a distinctive feature of an outstretched arm, a feature which could alternately be envisioned as a sword piercing through the constellation's side. So we could go further and further into even more details of these two accounts, but by now it should be overwhelmingly obvious that the details in the stories of the birth of the Buddha and the birth of the Christ have numerous undeniable parallels between them, and these details can be seen to be derived from a celestial origin, a celestial pattern that's underlying these stories. Does all this mean that these two accounts, these two stories, these two myths are not quote-unquote true? Absolutely not. I'm convinced that this ancient system of celestial myth was given to our distant ancestors in order to convey profound truth, truth that we very much need in all aspects of our lives. However, it does indicate pretty conclusively that these stories are not literally true in the sense of historical terrestrial events, the way they're often interpreted. And indeed, it indicates that they were probably never actually intended to be understood as accounts of literal terrestrial historical events. Literalistic interpretations of these stories tend to divide people from one another, and they can also divide us from the actual meaning that they're supposed to be conveying because they externalize the stories. But the understanding that virtually all of the world's ancient myths are built on this celestial system, the same celestial system, should in fact unite us. And it should also show us that these aren't stories about external events. They are stories that apply to spiritual matters and to internal matters of each and every man and woman who's ever lived. They are all part of a precious inheritance that was given to humanity in some extremely remote age for our benefit and our blessing, not for our detriment. I believe that the message conveyed by the ancient myths has to do with overcoming illusion and with becoming reconnected with the infinite, with which we're actually already connected, usually without being aware of it. The ancient wisdom given to humanity can help us to do that, and I believe that their message becomes much clearer once we learn to listen to them in the language that they're actually speaking, as we begin to understand what certain constellations, such as Virgo and Sagittarius and Ophiuchus, generally signify within that ancient system. It points to different parts of these heavenly cycles. And as we begin to understand that, then we can better apply their message to our lives.